The laughter started with the corn. Not after harvest. Not after prices collapsed. Before any of that. The laughter began when Margaret Hale refused to plant what everyone else planted. That was the first mistake, at least according to the county. Margaret stood beside a seed dealer's display one February morning while farmers crowded around bags of commercial hybrid corn. Everyone seemed interested in the same varieties. High yield, uniform ears, commodity market approved, predictable, safe. Margaret wasn't looking at any of those. Dale Harper noticed immediately. Naturally. He walked over carrying coffee, then frowned, then looked again. No. Margaret smiled faintly. Morning, Dale. He pointed toward the catalog. No. Long silence. What? That corn. Margaret glanced down. Oh. Dale folded his arms. You're not serious. The variety she selected wasn't common. Not even slightly. An old sweet corn strain originally grown decades earlier throughout portions of the Ozarks. Lower yield. Uneven years. Strange sugar profile. Difficult to market commercially. Exactly the reasons nobody planted it anymore. Margaret looked back at the catalog. I like it. Dale laughed. That's not how farming works. The Hale farm sat among rolling Missouri hills where corn dominated the landscape. Field corn. Commodity corn. Thousands upon thousands of acres. Everything looked similar. Everything sold into similar markets. Margaret's grandfather hated that. Samuel Hale believed farmers should understand what they grew, not just produce it. One summer evening, when Margaret was 14, she followed him through a small experimental field near the back pasture. Rows of unusual corn varieties stretched across the hillside. Different heights, different colors, different characteristics. Samuel stopped beside one particular row. Try this. Margaret pulled an ear, peeled it, took a bite. The sweetness hit instantly. Rich, complex, different. She frowned. That's good. Samuel smiled. Yes. Long pause. Then why doesn't everybody grow it? Samuel looked toward the field, then shrugged. Because everybody's chasing yield. That answer stayed with her. Because over time she noticed something. The highest yielding crop wasn't always the most valuable crop. People treated those ideas as identical. They weren't. Years later, after Samuel passed away, Margaret inherited the farm, along with several notebooks, field records, seed notes, experimental data, everything. One particular notebook mentioned the old sweet corn variety repeatedly. Flavor exceptional. Sugar profile unique. Market uncertain. Samuel underlined those words several times. Market uncertain. Most people saw that as a warning. Margaret saw a question, so she planted it. The county immediately decided she'd lost her mind. At the co-op, Dale created material instantly. Good news, everybody. Rick Harlow looked up. What? Margaret's planting garden corn. Laughter spread through the room. Margaret kept drinking coffee, ignoring them, mostly, but privately. The comments bothered her, because farming already carried enough uncertainty. No farmer enjoyed being reminded. The first harvest looked beautiful. The second looked better. The third looked incredible. The corn wasn't especially uniform, wasn't especially large, wasn't especially efficient, but it tasted remarkable. Anybody who sampled it agreed immediately. The problem? Taste doesn't automatically create a market. One autumn afternoon, Margaret hauled samples to the county co-op. Grant Mercer studied the ears carefully, then frowned, then called another employee over. Margaret hated that immediately. Nobody called additional people for good reasons. Grant picked up an ear. What variety is this? Margaret answered. Silence. Then, you actually planted acreage with it? Yes. Grant sighed. Not a promising sign. What? He turned the ear over. Margaret. Silence. This isn't commercial sweet corn. She folded her arms. It is sweet corn. You know what I mean. Long pause. Then, no. Grant pointed toward the kernels. Processors don't want it. Commodity buyers don't want it. Large distributors don't want it. The room became quiet. Margaret stared. Why? Grant shrugged. Yield. Uniformity. Consistency. Long pause. Then, so who buys it? Another shrug. Maybe roadside stands. Maybe local markets. Maybe livestock. Silence. Margaret blinked. Livestock. Grant smiled apologetically. Feed grade pays something. The room laughed. Not cruel laughter. The casual kind. The kind that hurts more. Because it means people genuinely believe what they're saying. Margaret picked up the sample tray. You serious? Grant nodded. Mostly. The drive home felt longer than usual. Feed grade. Feed grade. Feed grade. The words repeated inside her head. Years of effort. Years of selection. Years of maintaining a difficult crop. reduced to livestock feed. That evening she stood at the edge of the cornfield watching wind move across golden stalks. Emily Hale found her there. "You okay?" Margaret laughed once. Not because anything felt funny, because otherwise she'd probably be angry. "The co-op thinks I grew cattle feed." Silence. Emily blinked. "What? Feed grade?" Long pause. Then, "That might be the dumbest thing I've heard all week." Margaret smiled slightly. "Maybe, but privately." Doubt arrived. Because buyers weren't exactly lining up. Small roadside sales helped. Local customers loved the flavor. Restaurants purchased modest amounts. Nothing large. Nothing enough. Months passed. Then another season. Then another. The corn remained exceptional. The market remained frustrating. One September morning Margaret stood beside stacked harvest crates wondering whether everyone else had been right all along. Then she heard a truck. Not local. Definitely not local. A dark green delivery truck rolled slowly down the farm lane. Out-of-state plates. Dust covered the doors. The vehicle looked like it had traveled a very long way. It stopped beside the loading area. A man climbed out. Tall, gray-haired, travel-worn. He looked exhausted, like he'd spent the entire day driving. Then he looked at the corn and smiled. A real smile. Not the polite kind. Not the business kind. The kind people make when they've finally found exactly what they were searching for. He walked toward Margaret. Extended his hand. "My name's Henry Lawson." Margaret shook it. "Nice to meet you." Henry picked up an ear of corn from a nearby crate, examined it carefully, then looked back at her, and asked the question nobody at the co-op had ever asked. "Can I taste it?" Margaret stared at him for several seconds, because nobody had ever asked that question before. Not once. The co-op asked yield. Buyers asked acreage. Processors asked volume. Nobody asked what the corn tasted like. Henry noticed her expression, then smiled. "Is that unusual?" Margaret laughed softly. "A little." She handed him an ear. Henry peeled it carefully. The husk fell away. Golden kernels caught the afternoon sunlight. Then he took a bite. Silence. Absolute silence. He chewed slowly, then slower, then looked at the corn, then at Margaret, then back at the corn again. Finally, "Good grief." Margaret blinked. "What?" Henry took another bite. Then another. "Where did you get this variety?" The question surprised her, because nobody had ever cared. She explained. The old seed stock. Her grandfather's records. The years of selection. Everything. Henry listened closely. Closer than anyone else ever had. When she finished, he looked toward the field stretching across the hillside. Rows of corn moved gently beneath the September wind. Then he smiled. "I knew it." Margaret frowned. "Knew what?" Henry held up the ear. "This isn't commodity corn." Long pause. Then, "That's what everybody keeps telling me." Henry laughed. "No." He pointed toward the kernels. "I mean, that's a compliment." The next 2 hours disappeared. Henry walked through the fields, examined plants, tasted samples from different sections, asked questions about soil, rainfall, harvest timing, storage methods, everything. At one point, he simply stood quietly in the field, eating corn. Margaret and Emily exchanged glances. Neither knew what to make of it. Finally, Margaret asked, "So what exactly do you do?" Henry smiled. "Whiskey." Silence. Then, "Whiskey." He nodded. "Small batch bourbon and specialty whiskey." Long pause. Then, "And you drove all this way for corn?" Henry laughed. "Not just corn." He held up another ear. "This corn." That evening Henry stayed for supper. Afterward they sat on the porch overlooking the fields. The setting sun painted the hills gold. Henry leaned back in his chair. "Do you know what your problem is?" Margaret laughed. "Apparently, everybody does." He pointed toward the corn. "You've been talking to commodity buyers." Silence. Then, "So, commodity buyers don't sell flavor." The answer lingered, because it sounded so simple. Yet nobody had ever said it. Henry continued. "They buy volume. They buy consistency. They buy efficiency." He picked up an ear from the table beside him. "I buy character." Margaret looked toward the fields, then back at him. "Character?" Henry smiled. "Flavor people remember." The next morning, he loaded coolers with corn samples, then handed Margaret a business card. "Give me 3 weeks." She frowned. "For what?" Henry smiled. "To prove something." Then he drove away. The county laughed harder than ever after hearing about it. Naturally. At the co-op, Dale nearly dropped his coffee. "A whiskey maker?" Margaret nodded. "Yes." Silence. Then, "No." "Yes." "No." "Yes." Rick looked over. "You expect us to believe somebody drove across 3 states for corn?" Margaret shrugged. "Doesn't matter." "What?" "He already drove." That answer irritated Dale immediately. 3 weeks passed. then 4, then 5. Nothing. No calls. No contracts. No offers. By the 6th week, Margaret started feeling foolish. Maybe Henry had simply enjoyed a road trip. Maybe the county had been right all along. One evening, she stood beside the field watching autumn sunlight drift across the hills. Emily walked over. "You thinking?" Margaret nodded. "Yes." "Bad thinking." Long pause. "Maybe." Then headlights appeared at the end of the lane. A familiar green truck rolled slowly toward the farm. Emily sat up immediately. Margaret stood. The truck stopped. Henry climbed out carrying a thick folder. And unlike last time, he wasn't smiling. That worried Margaret immediately, because people usually smile when bringing good news. Henry walked toward her, then suddenly burst out laughing. A huge laugh. The kind people make when they're genuinely excited. "You have any idea what you've grown?" Margaret blinked. "Corn." Henry shook his head. "No." He spread papers across the hood of the truck. Laboratory analyses. Mash reports. Fermentation studies. Production notes. Page after page of information. Henry pointed at one report. Extraordinary sugar development. Another page. Exceptional fermentation behavior. Another. Unique flavor retention. Margaret stared, because none of those words meant much to her. Henry noticed, then simplified. "Your corn makes incredible whiskey." Silence. Then, "Oh." Henry laughed again. "That all you've got?" Margaret shrugged. "I don't know anything about whiskey." "Fair." Then he handed her a contract. She looked down. "Read the numbers." Stopped. "Read them again." Then once more. Because surely she'd misunderstood. "Surely. 7 times." Henry nodded. "Yes." Silence. 7 times market price?" "Yes." Long pause. Then, "For all of it." Henry smiled. "If you'll sell it." Emily nearly dropped the paperwork. Margaret simply stood there. Because the offer wasn't good. It wasn't great. It was unbelievable. The feed grade numbers disappeared instantly. Completely. Gone. The first shipment left the farm 2 weeks later. Then another. Then another. Specialized grain trailers rolled into the farmyard and hauled away every bushel she produced. People noticed immediately. Of course they did. Because unfamiliar trucks arriving repeatedly at a farm everyone mocked tends to attract attention. At the co-op, conversations changed quickly. Who's buying her corn? Some whiskey company. Paying premium prices. No way. Yes way. Grant Mercer hated every minute of it. Especially when Henry walked into the co-op one afternoon. The room fell silent. Grant looked up. "Yes." Henry smiled politely. "You're the man who called that corn feed grade." Silence. Nobody moved. Grant shifted uncomfortably. "Well," Henry nodded. "I wanted to thank you." Grant blinked. "Thank me." Henry smiled wider. "Yes." Long pause. "Why?" Henry looked around the room, then pointed toward the Hale farm beyond town. "Because if everybody understood its value." He shrugged. "I never would have gotten it." Nobody laughed. Not one person. 5 years later, the corn operation doubled, then expanded again. Other specialty buyers appeared. Distillers, brewers, artisan food producers. The same variety everyone mocked became one of the most sought-after specialty crops in the region. One autumn evening, Dale stood beside Margaret, overlooking the fields. Golden corn stretched across the hills beneath the setting sun. "You know what still bothers me?" Margaret smiled slightly. "What?" Dale stared toward the horizon. "I laughed at this." "Yes." "No, seriously." He shook his head. "For years. Wind moved through the corn. Long shadows stretched across the land.